This is the first lecture for Wednesday, April 15th. I just want to remind you that even though we're having these very unusual circumstances and we're having these classes in a very different way than everybody expected to, one of the things that we're still trying to do, even under these conditions, even under this type of teaching and learning atmosphere, is to accomplish the learning outcomes for this course. And we've done all of these different ways after spring break, but we've still done these and we're still trying to accomplish these so that by the end of the semester, even though this ecology class that you took is different than it started out, different than everybody expected, that you've still been able to attain these learning outcomes. The one that we're talking about now is energy, looking at energy flow through ecosystems. And then we'll move on to the flow of materials through ecosystems. So we've gone all the way from looking at individual organisms to populations, communities, and now we're looking at ecosystems. And we're looking at these two main things, the way that these move through ecosystems. First of all, energy is what the topic is for today, and then nutrients and elements that are important for living things. So in terms of energy, we've looked at energy flow through individual organisms. So an energy budget that all living things have, a certain amount of energy coming in that's channeled, allocated towards different energy demands. And then right now we're looking at energy flow through communities from one organism to another. And I wanted to remind you of this idea that energy is a one-way street. Energy comes from the sun and it moves through individual organisms, starting with photosynthetic organisms, primary producers. Some heat, actually a lot of heat, is lost in the transfer of energy from producers to consumers. Now, the producers are using the energy, chemical energy that was converted from light energy in the form of sugar. They burn that energy for their own purposes. It's an inefficient process, and a lot of that energy is lost as heat. Animals, consumers, burn fuel that they've consumed in the form of some kind of food, and a lot of energy is lost as heat. It's an inefficient process. Through all the different metabolic pathways that we have, all the enzymes that take place in the cells of living things, that inefficient process is made more efficient, but it's still, there's a lot of heat that's lost. So this is the pathway that energy takes. It's lost to the universe. It comes into living things, and then it's lost from producers, it's lost from consumers, it's lost from decomposers. Each step along the way, there's a lot of energy that's lost, and it's not cycled. The nutrients that we're going to see later are cycled. So we're looking at energy transfers within communities, and we've identified these different levels in terms of where you derive your energy. Do you make your own energy? Photosynthesis, photosynthetic organisms. Do you eat something? Do you eat plants? Or do you eat other animals? Do you eat animals that eat other animals, or do you eat animals that eat plants? Do you eat other animals that eat other animals that eat other animals? So there's different stages. Each step along the way, there's a lot of energy that's lost from energy being transferred from one organism to the next. So the last part of this topic of energy flow concerns trophic levels. And we're able to group organisms into different levels depending on how energy got to them in terms of what I just said before, that they have, if they're eating plants or they're herbivores, then that's one trophic level. The plants are eaten by some kind of consumer, primary consumer. That's one step. Energy has gone from plants to these consumers. If you're something that eats animals, though, then there's two steps. The plants are fed upon by some little insect that's eaten by a bird. So the bird is eating an insect that's eating plants. Two steps, two trophic levels. There's actually three trophic levels with two steps of energy transfer in between. So you can look at any organism out there. You can look at a buffalo, you can look at a wolf, you can look at an antelope, and you can categorize each species in a community into a trophic level based on how many steps there are for energy to reach that organism. So we looked at this idea of food chains. Now, a food chain gives you a very good idea of the trophic level. You've got a phytoplankton that's eaten by a zooplankton. That's one step. You've got this one trophic level where the phytoplankton is. Second trophic level where the zooplankton is. Now, these zooplankton are fed on by some little minnow. That's three trophic levels, three different levels with energy exchange. And then you've got this minnow that's eaten by some a fish that's a little bigger, like a mackerel eats this minnow. So that's four trophic levels. And then you have a little tuna that comes along and feeds on that mackerel. And then you have a big shark that comes and eats that tuna. So you have a shark that eats a tuna, that eats a mackerel, that eats a minnow, that eats a zooplankton, that eats a phytoplankton. All those different steps are trophic levels. That's a chain. But we also saw, realistically, those chains are just something that you would pull out and say, okay, this I can follow the flow of energy. But what's actually happening within a community is that this phytoplankton is being eaten by 12 different things, not just one. And though the zooplankton has been eaten by 15 different things, not just one. And the minnows are eating not just one thing, but they're eating a number of things, and they're being eaten by a number of things. So food webs are really more realistic in terms of energy flow amongst organisms. And so there's some generalizations that can be made in terms of trophic levels in communities. So we're going to look at some of those. One of the most obvious things has to do with size. Now, there's some exceptions to this, but for the most part, you have big things eating things that are smaller than them. And there's an increase in size each step of the trophic level. It's not always true, but for the most part, that's the trend that you see. You have a little phytoplankton that's eaten by a zooplankton that's bigger. You have a zooplankton that's eaten by a minnow that's bigger. You have a minnow that's eaten by a mackerel that's bigger. Mackerel eaten by a tuna that's bigger. Eaten by a shark that's bigger yet. So let's look at some of these generalizations in terms of trophic levels. Now we're going to see that these generalizations are trends that apply to a lot of trophic levels in a lot of communities, but there's certainly exceptions. So we'll look at these three different generalizations. First of all is the number of species in a food web. You've got all these different species that are interconnected. You've got this one that's being eaten by this and this and this. You've got this one that's eating this species and that species and other species. So this is fairly straightforward. It makes a lot of sense that the more species there are in a community or a food web, then the more interactions there are, the more links there are between species. So if you have a bunch of different species in a community, then the lines that you're drawing or the arrows that you're drawing, this species gets eaten by this one and this one and this one. Each one of those is an arrow connecting species, and this one eats this species and that species and another species. Those are all links or arrows or interconnectedness of different species. So the more complex a community is, the more species there are in a food web, then it makes sense that the more lines that you would draw connecting them, or the more links there are with other species. Another generalization with these trophic levels is that the number of steps from a primary producer to a top predator, the very top predator in a community, is small. The number of steps is relatively small. So you've got, with these examples that I keep giving, you've got a phytoplankton eaten by a zooplankton, that's 2. Zooplankton eaten by a minnow, that's 3. A minnow eaten by a mackerel, that's 4. A mackerel eaten by a tuna, that's 5. So in some ecosystems, the tuna would be the apex predator, the top predator. 5 trophic levels. Now, other ones, you'd have a big shark come along and eat that tuna. So you're up to 6. But if you look at all these different communities and all the different trophic levels within those communities, on land, in the ocean, close to shore, far away from shore, in very productive areas, in areas that aren't so productive, then typically the number of trophic levels you find in ecosystems is 5. So there's 5 steps, 5 organisms, 5 levels of organisms that are involved in this energy transfer from one organism to the next. Now we're going to see later on when we look at how efficient these energy transfers are from one trophic level to the next. They're not that efficient. Primary producer, a plant, produces a certain amount of energy. It uses a lot of that energy for itself. So there's a lot of energy that's not available to whatever is going to eat this plant because the plant's using it itself. Then you have this plant, parts that aren't digestible or that are lost. If you think about that individual energy budget that we looked at earlier in one of the lectures, that there's a certain amount of energy that's consumed that's not used by whatever ate that food. So if you look at how much energy is in one trophic level and makes it to the next trophic level, on average, it's only about 10% of the energy that's converted from one trophic level to the next. That next trophic level, it's using a lot of energy. It has a high metabolic rate, metabolic demands. There's only a little bit of energy in phytoplankton that's going to make its way to a zooplankton. There's only a little bit of energy in a zooplankton that's going to make its way to a minnow. And on average, it's about a 10% efficiency. So 90% of the energy that's in a phytoplankton is lost, not available, not for deposition as tissue, growth, reproduction in the zooplankton. And then about 90% of the energy in the zooplankton is unavailable, doesn't make its way into a biomass of the minnows. And so that's pretty common. We'll look at that more in detail later, but for now, that goes into this idea that there's not very many trophic levels. There's energy that's lost and energy that's lost and energy that's lost. So when you get to these higher trophic levels, 5 trophic levels, 6 trophic levels, 7, 8, 9, you can imagine the tiny little fraction of energy that has made its way up to these 6th, 7th, and 8th order trophic levels from the initial amount of energy that was in some primary producer. Yeah, another thing is this idea that most organisms out there don't just eat one thing. There are some cases where they're highly specialized and they only have one prey item. But most predators prey on a number of different species. There's a number of different prey, and most prey have a number of different predators. So if you look in these different communities, and you look at these different food webs, you look at these different trophic interactions, who eats who, then there's a fairly consistent relationship between the number of prey species and the number of predator species. That there's 2 or 3 prey species for every predator species. And a lot of this boils down to energy. That if you're a predator and you're only getting about 10% of the energy that's in the trophic level below you, because 90% is lost, then there just isn't enough energy to support the same number of predators. So it takes 2 or 3 prey species to support one predator. And each step that you go up in the trophic level, there's less and less and less energy to support higher trophic levels. And so the number of species in these trophic levels declines as you get into higher trophic levels. The number of individuals in the species in those higher trophic levels declines. So ultimately you get to the point where there's not very many big predators. There's not very many species that are big predators, and there's not very many individuals in a population that are big predators. We'll see some of that when we look at this, the energy relations and the efficiency of energy transfer. Well, we talked about the first law of thermodynamics in this class earlier, that energy can't be created or destroyed, it just changes forms. Light energy to chemical energy, sugar, ATP, that electrons, a proton gradient in cells. There's different forms of energy that organisms experience. So, the second law of thermodynamics is this entropy, or that everything tends towards randomness, that the energy is lost. And you have this, when you have a transfer of energy from one trophic level to the next, there's a great deal of loss. Now it's conserved, it's still energy, but most of that energy is lost as heat. And so if you look at what happens when energy is transferred from one trophic level to the next, then these laws of thermodynamics come into play, and they really reflect how much energy makes its way from one trophic level to the next. It's not very much. So let's look at this idea of ecological efficiency, which is what I was talking about before in terms of how much energy makes its way from one trophic level to the next. There's a lot of energy that's used by plants, a lot of energy that's used by consumers. Like antelope uses a lot of that energy. And then this antelope gets eaten by a wolf. So the wolf gets about 10% of the energy that was in an antelope, that gets about 10% of the energy that was in the plants. There's this, on average, 90% reduction in energy from one trophic level to the next. Now that's a very big energy loss. And as I said, when you go from one trophic level to the next to the next to the next, it has this big amplifying effect on how much energy is available. And so if you look at the relationship between the amount of biomass, or if you weighed all the organisms that made up these different trophic levels, you'd see there's a very big decrease in the amount of biomass as you move from one trophic level to a higher trophic level. Now that makes sense because there's just not that much energy that's available for these higher trophic levels, especially when you get to a 5th trophic level, 6th trophic level. The fraction of energy that's available as a proportion of what was originally there in some plant is very small. And so if an observation that ecologists have made over the years is, or question, why are large, fierce animals so rare? Why are there so few big, large predators? Well, it has to do with energy. So here's this idea of a trophic pyramid, or that shows how much energy, how much biomass there is in these different trophic levels. So here we have 4 trophic levels. We've got, this is a terrestrial ecosystem, a terrestrial community where we've got all these plants. If you look at the amount of biomass and productivity in that scale over there on the right, and these are just these arbitrary units, but they have units. This is grams per square meter per year, so that's biomass. If you weighed all the plants in this community, there's about 1,000 grams of plants per square meter per year. Now, they're eaten by rabbits. In this case, the herbivore or the consumer are rabbits eating these plants. So that's one trophic level. And you can see over there the ecological efficiency, or the amount of energy that makes its way from a plant to a rabbit, is 20%. So that's relatively high. But in other words, 80% of the energy that's in those plants is lost. So this next trophic level, there's about 200 grams of rabbits per square meter per year, which is a 20% of the case for plants. And now you've got these little rabbits running around. There's a fox that's ready to eat these rabbits and does eat these rabbits. Now in this case, the efficiency of energy transfer from the rabbits to the fox is 15%. Still not bad. But that's only 15% of that 200 grams per square meter per year. So for foxes, if you looked at all the foxes in this community, you'd see that there's only a few foxes, and it's the biomass of the foxes is only about 15% of the biomass of the rabbits, which was only about 20% of the biomass of those plants. And now you have some hawk or eagle that's preying upon foxes sometimes, this top level predator. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 trophic levels. This is a community that doesn't even have that many trophic levels. Now if you look at the eagle, let's say that's an eagle that's eating the foxes, that ecological efficiency is only about 10%. So only 10% of that energy that's in foxes makes its way to these eagles. So that in terms of the biomass, the grams per square meter per year for eagles is only 3. So you can see how this 3 grams per square meter per year of eagles compares to the foxes, compares to the rabbits, compares to the plants. These ecological efficiencies, 20%, 15%, 10%, they're not bad. But still, you get to where these top predators have a tiny little bit of energy that's available for them, because most of the energy is lost from plants to rabbits. Most of the energy is lost from rabbits to foxes, and even more of the energy is lost from foxes to eagles. So this is the type of pyramid in terms of the amount of biomass, in terms of the amount of energy that's available, in terms of the number of predators, in terms of the number of individuals within a species. That's common whether you're looking at this terrestrial ecosystem with eagles as the top predator, or some marine ecosystem where killer whales are the top predator. This is the type of ecological efficiency that you see in these trophic pyramids. There just isn't very much energy to go around when you get to these higher trophic levels. All right, well, this is a good place to stop for this first lecture. We've just got a little bit of, well, it's a decent amount of content to look at in terms of energy flow through ecosystems. This is going to be different from flow of nutrients through ecosystems because it's really one way. But we'll look at that in the second lecture.